So welcome to our part 2 of structural racism and spirituality. We're really blessed to have Khadija Chashan Washington, who's the author of Real, and she's joining us today in this discussion. And so I'll let you do a little self-intro and maybe talk a little bit about the book.
Okay, great. Well, my name is Khadija Chashan Washington. I am a licensed clinical social worker living licensed in Virginia. I'm originally from New York, and what I did was last couple weeks ago, I published my first book called Real, which stands for Radical Empathic Acceptance of Life. And initially, it was all about like a memoir of how I became a social worker. Like, what were all the forces? What were all of the things that made me a social worker? And a lot of it had to do with my childhood, the chaos, the generational, as I talk about generational trauma that I experienced, and my curiosity about how families like mine became families like mine. And so that was kind of the impetus of wanting to write. And then the major part of that in the beginning of the book kind of talks about having a son and being a single parent and wanting to end that generational trauma. So it was just, I don't even like saying I'm spiritual, that all of the things that are happening in this country and around the world are happening now, because it's really given a platform to talk about how, on a personal level, people are impacted by implicit bias and racism and all of the systems that are supposed to help us, education and parenting and financial, all those things. So really kind of memoirs the struggle, and then working as a wounded helper and healer, how to kind of overcome some of those things.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. And you were actually invited onto the show by Freshta. So how did the two of you know each other?
Yeah, I think we knew each other through our mutual friend, Angela Acamando. And Angela and I have been actually friends since middle school. So we both went to Farley Middle School, and like reconnected one day via Facebook. I was visiting New York, and we started hanging out some years ago in Brooklyn, and we have been inseparable ever since.
That's so funny because I actually met Freshta through Angela.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
She knows everybody.
She knows everybody.
Everywhere she goes, she meets people.
Maybe we'll have her on the show next.
Yes.
Very good, very good. So where do we want to start the discussion? Where would you like to start the discussion?
I think so many things are going on, so it's really like I think most of the conversation I've had this week has really been unpacking racism for people who are non-Black. And it's been really good conversations, because I realized, I always say like most of my work is around like generational trauma and Black trauma, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm used to working with Black people. When I'm pushed to sort of have conversations, uncomfortable as they may be with white people, I have to almost explain to Black people that they don't understand, because Black people really think, how do you not understand something that we see every day?
Right.
Like it's automatic for us, and it's almost like not, but explaining really in terms of when you don't have to, right? Like Black people have to understand how to navigate in the white world. White people don't have to navigate in a Black world.
Right.
There's really rarely ever white people who have to come into an all Black space and work and live and eat and be educated.
Yeah.
So that's really this week has been like the explaining to both sides how like everybody's been fed the same lie, but we come to different places in our relationships with the other, because we really don't trust that the other didn't see something that they saw, or the other didn't believe that we didn't see it.
Yeah. And it is an uncomfortable or difficult conversation, because we feel like we're on like opposing ends of that spectrum, right? Like I'm never going to know what it's like to have lived your life, and you're never going to know what it's like to have lived my life, right? Up until this point. And now these conversations, I feel like there's like this awakening that's happening. I've been having a ton of conversations with mostly white people, but also some Black people. I'm leaning more into having conversations with white people who have historically not realized their own privilege, their own place in the world, the fact that they have not had to have the same experiences as Black people, right? So I was thinking about it the other day, and I was having a conversation with someone, I guess it was yesterday or 2 days ago, and I realized I didn't think about it until this week, but in high school, my best friend was Black. And I remember going over to her house, and her family was having a barbecue. And I was like, cool, I'm going over to Tracy's house. She's having a barbecue. I walked into the backyard, and I was the only white person there. And I think that was the first time, and that took me till I was in high school. That was the first time where I was like, oh, this is what it must feel like for Tracy in like every day.
Yeah.
And it was like that awareness, but I didn't remember that until this week, you know?
Wow.
So,
that's powerful. And, I think that, what's really for me, because, I think having the conversation is so important. I don't really feel, and maybe I haven't dug deep in my own psyche, that I feel like it's an uncomfortable conversation, because I don't feel like it's an uncomfortable conversation. And I don't know what it's like to be Black in America. But I think all of us on this panel are empathic. And there's that sense of empathy that allows us and creates a need in us to want to know more, to understand more.
To be curious about it.
And then to help and to understand. And there's like, I feel like, I want to have these conversations. I've always wanted to have these conversations. Right. And it is going to be very uncomfortable for a lot of people, but people that are, empathic, that are willing to kind of be that, that kind of spokesperson, or that beacon, or that kind of lamppost that will hold the light for us to understand that this is time that the light should be shined. We need to open up our eyes and have these conversations. And I think that's what's so important,
Yeah, I think the conversation, what I've said to a lot of people who look like myself is I've really tried to work on putting myself in this space. Like people say, like, I'll never know how it is to be Black or go through that experience. It's like, but we don't understand how it's like to carry privilege.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? And we don't know how it's like to walk through life and know that every door is going to probably be open for us.
Mm-hmm.
We have no idea what it's like to have to struggle with, I know this is the right thing to do, but how does that change my life now going forward?
Right.
How much harder does it make things for myself going forward? How do I have even the conversations with my racist uncle or my racist aunt around not using certain words, or even having certain scripts in their head? Because what I do know, like I was like, I'm not an expert on white people because I just don't have enough experiences, but I've never met a white person who didn't have a white racist relative, like outwardly racist relative that they could point to and say, yeah, I remember when he said that story, or they made that statement, or they didn't hire that person because of this. But there's almost no person who will ever admit to being racist. Like not even the Ku Klux Klan will admit to being racist.
Yeah.
It's just racist. It's just the new N word.
Yeah. Speaking about this conversation, sorry, and Kelly, it just sparked a memory that I just had, when I was living in Worcester, Mass, years ago, probably in my 20s. My boyfriend and myself at the time, our best friends was a Black couple. And I remember we did it more than once. I think we did it 3 or 4 times. You might laugh at that, but it was when Do the Right Thing was first, that movie first came out, Do the Right Thing. And we would have parties. We would have Do the Right Thing parties. And we would have a group of white people and Black people, and we would watch the film together, right? And then we would have an open discussion about points that came up in that film. And I think, that's going back. When did that film was released? I mean, that's going back. That
was a long time ago.
Family to at least 25 years ago. So, I think that, I think there have been people that have been ripe for this conversation for a long time. And I think that now, witnessing what has been going on, again, going back to the breathing of what the horrific thing that we witnessed with George Floyd, more people are open for that conversation, and an open conversation, and understanding both sides of the situation of the cause. I don't even know how to even say that, but there has to be an understanding, an opening, an open heart to what's going on,
Yeah, and I wanted to chime in there, the open heart piece of just everyone, right? The
Yes.
The no sides. Like, yes, we have our diversity, of course, we are different. And yet the no sides piece feels really vital to me right now. Like everyone leaning in. And this is why, Khadija, it's so vital that we have your voice here, because I think if we are insulated, you know, even as a person of color, that not hearing what you go through every day, not getting that clear picture of suffering, of the intensity of suffering, all the collective voices coming up now, yes, it's painful, but I personally would rather hold and carry that with my brothers and sisters and be an ally, obviously not on the front line, but allied. So the voices, to me, it's like if everyone just shared what their experience was, we would be immersed in that knowing, right? We would be able to hold it with it's not even a priority, a real sense of urgency, because it's being shared with us. And for me, that has felt like the gap. Personally, I don't know if that lands for you.
I think I think the struggle, because I know a lot of people who do race work, and I think the struggle is always getting Black people to share in with white people, because of what we're seeing right now is the acknowledgement that I haven't been listening for however many years, right? So it's like the sharing is important to getting to the trust, where I trust that you're going to hear me, is to me even a step before the sharing, because I'm sharing. I mean, granted, this book, I'm sharing really intimate parts of my family and really intimate parts of, you know, how my father was, you know, beaten by the police, and how my mother suffered with mental illness, and how many of my brothers and sisters went into institutions and even jail and prisons and things like that, at very young ages. And like sensitive information, that's why I'm careful about changing names and things like that. But I know a lot of people who have the same story that I have that aren't going to be willing to share in that way. And even the experiences that I've had sharing in, you know, really diverse crowds and churches and book clubs, it's sort of, you get I'm sharing, but now that pain becomes about, it's too much for me to handle. It's too much for the non-Black person to handle. Mm-hmm. And so it becomes around, now I have to share, I'm in pain, now I have to comfort you about not giving you too much of my pain because of your fragility. So now I have two jobs to deal with my stuff.
Yeah, but you should worry about that.
It's so many steps. And I think it's encouraging to talk to young people now, because now, you know, we have allies that are saying, hurt our feelings. Yes. You know what I mean? Like, really, it's okay. We can take it. We know something's wrong. We know something's broken, but it's okay. We have to hurt each other's feelings for a little bit. Be prepared to, you know, to hurt and come in with, like you said, an open heart, because both sides are really like, okay, this hurts to hear that I've been ignoring something for so long. And then it also hurts to acknowledge that we work together and we're maybe live by side, and you still haven't really seen me. Right. And, you know, how do we
and
get
that's
to
important. Seeing is so important.
Everybody wants to be seen and heard, but
I think so. And, you know, I mean, I think what we're talking about, this conversation and with an open heart, you know, you're looking at the protests and the rallies and things that are happening right now. And at some point, and the change that's happening, because that is phenomenal and so exciting that, you know, there's actually been, like, I picture this as like an iceberg, right? What's happening. And what's happening right now is the very tip of the iceberg. The police brutality and the injustice is the very tip of a very, very big problem. And I just see that this is a melting of the tip of that iceberg. And what I feel like, you know, if the energy of the rallies and the protests start to diffuse, you know, what is the next step? Because that's what and the next step is these conversations, creating groups that we can take, creating, you know, communities that will create groups that keep the dialogue alive. Right?
I think that's part of it, though. Having conversations is definitely the next step. But for me, the way that I think about it is, like, if you're going to commit to living an anti-racist life, like, you have to take an action or actions, plural, every single day for the rest of your life. You don't have to take it all on yourself, but you've got to do something to the point where it becomes habitual and organic and just like the way that you show up in the world, right?
Of course.
And some of that means redistribution of power or wealth, or supporting Black businesses, anti-racist causes, whatever those situations are.
No, you're absolutely right. So, and that's the issue too. Besides a racist issue, it's an issue of power. You know, very few. There's an elite of people that have the power, and that's had the power for a long time, and that needs to change, because it's very. I think that's the root. That's
structural racism.
That's the base of the iceberg. You know.
Yeah. I recorded a podcast episode yesterday for the other podcast that I do, and we talked about anti-racism and our human agency. And the guest that I had on was talking about how he's part of like a couple of civic boards in Queens and Long Island City. And he said, you know, basically, when you look at the budgets for all of the cities across the country, they are essentially police departments with a couple of social services on the side. Like the police departments are getting 60 to 70% of every city's budget. And then the rest of it trickles down into like maybe some education, maybe some healthcare, maybe this, maybe that. And that, there you go, imbalance, right?
Exactly.
Like, why is that the case? And then you wonder like how the situation happened where, you know, I do think that there has to be a defunding or a deprioritization of that, because that is not the most important thing. It's supporting one another and making sure that everyone has the resources that they need, right?
I agree, Kelly. Yeah, and I, having worked in finance for longer than I can say, I find that I believe personally that a budget is a moral document. Like, it is a spiritual document of what you're choosing to invest in your community. So if we look at our politics as our spiritual beliefs manifest, we need to work out what's going on underneath, right? Our belief systems of, do we really value defense that much versus nourishing the beloved?
And I think when you're talking about defense and 60% going into police, this is probably going to be mainly policing in Black communities.
Correct.
And that's where the bulk of these policing is. When I go to a white community, I don't see a whole ton of law enforcement presence like I do if I go into a predominantly Black neighborhood. Right. But I think, like you said, it sets a bigger picture of, this is the priority, is militarizing these people and making sure they stay in line and making sure they're law abiding and having rules. And I think that's spiritually what's awakening now, especially with protesters and rioters. It's like, we're not going to live like that anymore.
No.
We're not going to live living in this project. We're not going to live in you're not going to hold us in by these ideals. And that, I feel like, I know people are really, because I hear it all the time, like they're really scared about the riots. Like we can't go, like I work even in corporate America, and I'm like, we had 1 hour conversations about what's going on, and I didn't hear one person say racist or Black or any justice for, like, it was everything but. And that's why I was like, we have so far to go, because social injustice could be with any group, right? Like diversity inclusion could be with any group, women included. But we have Black people who are suffering, and we can't say the word Black in a corporation that's 23% Black,
right?
Or 13%. Like, so it's like, we're not even in a place where, you know, companies are really having to, and I think it's great. Like, people, they're putting pressure to say, where do you stand? There's only two. And to me, it's like, you don't have to stand with Black people. You have to stand for justice. You don't even have to be Black to stand for justice. And I think it was eye-opening when I hear people, like the young lady said, she wasn't going to be on the side. She was Black, but she wasn't going to be on the side of protesters because her husband was a police officer. And so she couldn't be on the other side. And I had to really think about that. Why? They're not protesting your husband being a police officer. They're protesting injustice. And I would think, you coming from a family of law enforcement, your value would be justice. Right. But that's not the way people see it.
Right.
And
Well,
that's the way media makes
that is a tough situation. My brother's a police officer, and I have, you know, Jackie's husband is a police officer, and you know, we just have to be careful because we are looking for justice. But you know, I went to go see my friend Sean yesterday, and his young daughter, who's 12 or 13, has been going to these rallies and protests. And she comes home and she says, "Dad, I'm not going to use the F word, but you know, please, we need to like, you know," she was like, she wanted to hurt them, physically hurt them. You know, she was so like, you know, she was taking everything that was happening and placing it on the police. But and the police is just like the you know, the part of that tip of the iceberg. It's the politics, it's the policies, it's the precincts, it's not having accountability, it's so many things. And you know, my brother, he was told that they should hide their police vehicles in the garage because they're afraid of being houses being burnt, and there's been threats. And you know, I understand in the Black community that's been the way they've lived their life, and there's no excuse for that. That is not justice. And what's happening with the police and my brother, who's been a very good cop for 35 years, being afraid for his family, that's not where we want to go either. So we need to find that justice. We need to find that middle way, you know, because you know, hate and like, you know, the spirit of hate is colorless.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I think for the police,
sorry,
the way, the least that I see it is, and maybe some other people see it, is it's not the police, right? It's like the police are enforcing the system, right?
Exactly.
And
I agree with that.
that's the huge problem. It's not like individual police that were like, you're wrong, even though unfortunately these police officers are going to be more at risk because they're part of the system that supports the supremacy. Right. So it's like they're in a really, I would admit, difficult place. But if we see continually Black people being killed and the police standing around and watching,
true,
that's what you're like. I don't believe the one bad apple and two bad apples, and it's too many apples.
They don't have accountability, and they have that. They do have a sense of a brotherhood, you know, and it's a military, you know,
construct.
Yeah, you know, it's like you don't tell on your brother. It's like when you're in the military, you know, you're a family and you protect that. But that needs to go away.
Right.
You know,
because it's really hurting them. Like it's
hurting
really
them. It's hurting them.
That's what I want people to understand is like, if you support, you know, this system of racism, the world is opening up and they're going, but they know this is more than bad apples. This is more than a couple bad cops or couple cops. This is, like you said, they have a brotherhood and they are almost like I say, just like how gangs are. Someone kills the people in the gang don't go and snitch. So we're dealing with a gang that is making it legal.
It's a gang mentality. Yeah.
Yeah, it's that gang mentality. And it's like, it's difficult. It's like the whole restructuring of police, the whole law enforcement, how police even started. I mean, they really started as sort of the people who catch slaves. And for large part, that image is not different than what it is today. So it's no relationship building.
I agree.
It's no community building. It's just, we've been doing it this long, so long. We don't know how to do it any other way. And
it does. It stems from those old laws, and it's absolutely true. And another thing too is like, I don't know exactly. Is it 8, 12, even 6? I don't know. I don't think it's very long to go through the police academy.
6 months, I think.
You know, I think that should be a 2-year period. I think they need to have much more training. You know, and I think that, you know, I think that's a part of the problem. The training, they need to train with high stress situation in a better way. And you just, you know, these young rookies being thrown out into the streets, and they probably all have some form of post-traumatic stress disorder at some point. They just don't know how to handle it. They have no way to talk to it, and they have that brotherhood, that gang mentality, and they get themselves in a place of allowing injustice to happen in front of them and not saying anything, you know, or not having the voice, or feeling that they don't have a voice to say anything.
Yeah.
And that's, again, a structural problem that needs to be addressed within the police academy and the police force.
Yeah. Well, and the work is really counter-instinctual. right? Because they think the fraternity vibe has their back.
Yeah.
And yet I imagine for many of those on the task force, they went in because they believed in goodness and justice.
I'm sure, yeah.
So it's really like you've become loyal to the wrong energy, right?
Yeah,
And
energetically, yeah.
what moved me was a friend saying, this isn't Black people versus white people, this is Black people against racism. So like, where are you in that allyship? Right?
That's a great way to put
not
it.
Black people against cops. It's really us versus racism. And I'd love, Khadija, for you to explain maybe the structural piece even more deeply if you feel called, because I think we are only seeing the tip of the iceberg, and I can only imagine what's underneath.
Yeah, I think you're right. The tip of the iceberg is what I would say. For people who are on either side, the police or protesters or however you anti-racist side, I'm really very quite, put it to you like this. When people say, well, how are you doing, Khadija? I'm like, I'm doing how basically I've always been doing. Like, is it ever, and it's experience traumatic as it is to watch Mr. Floyd have his life taken away. I have to acknowledge that if I know my history, and I do, this is no different from the lynchings that have been happening for 400 years. And because I live in Virginia and I live 12 miles from where a slave landing is and Cora Landing, like we go and visit and we talk and we do our history. And it's like, I think the disconnection is people are now starting to open their eyes to see, wait, this has been a system, and a very sophisticated one. And the police department, I believe young men and women who are like, hey, I want to do something in my community. And I think it does start off like that. And then they get into the, like you said, kind of gang mentality of, well, what do I do now? Like, if I say something, then the next time something happens, that could be my life. That could be my life that people don't show up for. That could be the call that I don't. So it's the same thing in the gang. It's like, you can't get out because you're going to get hurt, and you can't stay in because you're going to hurt more people. So it's going to take a lot of energy, a lot of prayer, a lot of spiritual, a lot of law reformation to just say, I got to look at this thing differently. And people should be looking at it differently. Even when I talk about, like I said in the book, my father passing away, and I like to make it really super personal. My father died from a seizure. That's what he died from. But the way he developed seizures was because he was beaten by a police officer after trying to jump a turnstile to get on the train. And I learned that growing up from maybe 3, 4, 5 years old. He passed away when I was 6. So you think about the experience of not having a father from teenage time, 20s, getting married, having a baby, not having a father that entire part of your life. And I had a brother, so he had a son. But you're taking someone away from their family for 40, 50 years. And that's how you have to look at why policing and the way that police are so militarized in Black communities. I'm pretty sure there's been plenty of people who have jumped turnstiles, and there's plenty of people who've stole or done something. But I don't see that happening if my father was a white man who did the same exact thing. And that's what I think is so important to, like, I would say, like, people think about fighting racism, like, don't do slavery, don't say the N-word, don't shoot or hit or beat someone up. But really the long impacting parts of generational trauma that slavery causes impacts the family, poverty, connection, relationship, knowing what it's like to have a father, knowing what it's like to have a healthy relationship with a man, health, like him struggling with seizures all of his life from that point on. And then just the brutality, I have to think about, like, I wasn't there, but if I'm beaten to that point, how am I going to look at the next police officer when I do make it out that hospital? Not the same. And that's how a lot of young boys that look like my son look at police officers. I have to fear them. Like, I live in a pretty racially mixed community, but mostly Black Mexican people. And a friend was bringing him home, and they were stopped right in front of the house because I guess the tag light or something was out. my son was like 13 years old. He was with a bunch of his friends. My son just, he's talking to the driver. My son gets out the back seat and just pops open the door and starts walking, and everyone stops. And he was just like, oh, I got out because I'm home. And I had to sit down and explain to him, you can't move in front of police officers like that. You have to tell them what you're doing. You have to explain things. That's where I feel like when people say, oh, I didn't notice, we've had to notice because it's meant our survival.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
I want to go back to something that you said a little bit earlier. We were talking about, just what racism is or what it means to be racist. And you initially started out talking about so-and-so was overtly racist, right? And I think this is also something that we need to start really talking about and diving into, because every white person in America is racist. Yeah. You cannot deny that fact. You may not like it. It may feel very confronting to you, but I think the association that we have with being racist is generational, right? Like if you really look at the history of it, you had the civil rights movement where people in the North saw how Blacks were being treated by quote unquote overt racists in the South, right? And they were like, oh, racists look like this. They look like white people, mostly white men, who beat Black men, women, and children, right? So racists are bad, right? And in the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, she talks about this good, bad binary. And I think that's a really slippery slope, because if you associate as racists are bad people, then that's why you're not hearing in your corporate job the term race or racism or racist, because nobody wants that association on themselves. But once we can start to open up and say, from history, from generations, from the systems and institutions that we live in this country, every white person is racist. You cannot not be.
Right.
And if you start to talk about it, you start to identify it, that's when you can start to change it. That's my belief, or that's what I've learned over the last couple of weeks. And that to me is a whole different paradigm than what I've ever known before.
And I think talking to white people and hearing them say things like, but I don't carry my privilege. I don't have any privilege. And I have to explain to them, it's not something you can put on like a book bag. Like you look the way you look, even if you weren't quote white, but you looked, right? Like phenotype white, like people aren't gonna, ask you for your birth certificate. You're gonna be identified one way or the other. Like that's the country we live in, but it's not anything that you can get away from. And it's not something that at this point, it's almost like, what do you do with it? Are you gonna use it, like you said, to be anti-racist and to really look at your life? And this is gonna take time because your thinking has been such for 30, 40, 50 years, your grandparents thinking, your parents thinking. And I think, like you said, like I was talking to Angela about, people, especially down south, they look at racists like Ku Klux Klan, which actively recruits in these counties and counties around Virginia. And even with those recruitments that come out and they put them in mailboxes in certain neighborhoods, even when you read it, you wouldn't think this was a Ku Klux Klan. Racism has gotten so sophisticated to the point where they don't even use the word supremacy, racist, these like key buzzwords. They will say American values, conservative values, family values. And it's confronted all the, like I go to the YMCA, right? I go for a swimming class. There's a white woman who's my swim instructor. And this was a few years ago. And she says, the Ku Klux Klan is going to have a meeting at the library in Chesterfield County. And everyone's up in a roar. People are protesting outside the library because they feel like it's a public place and hate speech is not. So you have the two sides, freedom of speech. Do they do it? Do they not? And we're in a class full of, Native American, East Indian, myself, other Black people, white people. And she says, I don't understand what the big deal is. The Ku Klux Klan is a Christian organization. Oh. The red in their uniforms, that's the blood of Christ.
Wow.
I mean, and she had nothing.
Right.
And people were like, why didn't you correct her? Why didn't you? Because she doesn't want to be called out.
And it's also not your job.
And I was like, it's not my job. I got up, I got my stuff, I changed, I stopped going to the Y, I went to the other gym. That was my protest, is I don't have to come back.
Right.
But they want to make it every Black person's job to correct. And I'm like, first of all, that's not safe for people. You need to ask Black people. There's enough people who are willing to teach and are willing to open themselves up to have that work, or even if it's their part of their business, that will teach you and show you and be your guide and be your accountability person, that you don't have to ask every Black person to do that.
Right. I mean, it reminds me of something that Owen said on part 1 of this series, about how he felt like when some of his white friends would make a joke that was inherently racist, he would not speak up because he didn't want to make them feel uncomfortable. And right. He was like, you know what? I have to look at that in myself, you know?
Oh, yeah. I think we've all had, I mean, especially with this kind of hair like mine, I've had people try to touch my hair a number of different times. And I mean, now it's like, not so much, I work more at home, but yeah, it's almost like, I think every Black person's like, I don't want to fight today. Is it worth it today? And sometimes it has been. Sometimes I've had to be like, because maybe I had kids with me or whatever, like, hey, don't do that, and speak up. And then sometimes it's like, you know, I can just leave and not come back again. And I think the important thing is it's your decision. It's obviously your choice. And it's up to, like you said, white people to really do their own work and connect with someone who's willing to hold them accountable, versus it's our job to fix this that we never started, what we're victims of. And if you don't do it, then it's not going to change. You know, we've done a lot for this country. So
yeah, it's definitely not your job. I said this in the last episode too, but racism is a white problem and it's only going to be fixed by white people. And that's right. About sharing our power, sharing our platforms, redistributing our wealth and that power, whatever ways in which we feel comfortable or called to do that. That's how this changes. It's about allyship.
Yeah.
We have that privilege and we need to share that privilege so that everybody has everything that they need and there is this rebalance, you know.
Yeah, rebalancing. And I think that's why I try to share so many stories about how racism impacts me, people like myself today, because people really think slavery's not here, segregation's not here, all of these things aren't here, but it's still very much a swim class in my education and my guidance counselor telling me, don't go to college. Even in health, like I posted on my Instagram, a picture of a tumor that I had 10 years ago. And I was like, what does this have to do with racism? And the thing was, I kept going to my doctor for 1.5 years with symptoms saying I didn't feel right. I felt tired all the time. I was exhausted. And because I looked the way that I look, it was, you're stressed out. You got a lot going on. Your life is, you know what I'm saying? I was a social worker and I still am, but I was in the field at that time. And she gave me everything from hypertension pills to anxiety medication. And just on a fluke, I wound up in the emergency room for gallbladder issue. When they did they did the ultrasound, they found a tumor on my adrenal gland. And it was a pretty rare tumor, but I was like, how did this get missed for 1.5 years? If I wouldn't have accidentally showed up in the emergency room for something else that was totally not even related, I would have been in a hypertensive coma and probably passed on.
And that doctor wrote you off because of your skin color.
Right. She did what so many doctors, whether they want to acknowledge it. And I'm so glad that now, like, doctors are actually getting together and saying, really exploring this implicit bias, like relieving Black people when they say they're in pain. And they're doing the, you know, making the lifestyle changes. I changed jobs. I stopped working so many hours. I'd done all the things she said to do. I ate less meat and all this kind of stuff. And I was still like, I'm still having these headaches. I'm still having these night sweats. I'm still having all these things. And she never once said, you need to go see a specialist. It would have taken a $25 24-hour urine test to detect the hormones that were being excreted from my kidneys, just to confirm that. Like, which they did in the emergency room. Once I came in, they confirmed it. It was like, yeah, this is what you have, and there's no cure for it, but you have to have surgery. But I just wonder how many other women, because she had a huge practice, were coming in and saying, this is what's wrong with me. And they were just
being dismissed.
Right.
Yeah. And that's part of the healthcare system, right? We're talking about structural racism. It lends itself into every one of these areas.
Every place, yeah.
Yeah. And this makes sense to me in terms of the protests and the immense amount of outrage of like perpetually being dismissed. You know, you said not believed. Like, how much can someone take not being believed for their valid experience? Like, it blows my mind.
Yeah, I think that's where the conversation has to start, is the vulnerability of acknowledging that I'm believed, that I'm going to be heard, that I'm going to be supported. Because far too long it's been like, why? And I didn't understand, 10 years ago, like, why would this doctor find it? And granted, it is a fairly rare thing, but even in other doctor's appointments, like, I'm hurting, but it'll go away in 6 months. Oh, it'll subside. And then you go to another doctor, well, this is not really for Black women. And just, these are some studies, and like, why aren't you reading the studies and how it impacts Black women or Hispanic women? Like, why is medicine catered to? You know what I'm saying? So that's why I want people to understand that I don't want people to go around watching slave videos to understand racism, because that's not where we are. We're in a different part of this, and it's not the police, the healthcare system, this is our new slavery. This is the slavery we need to change now.
Exactly. All these old paradigms need to be
upended,
gone. Exactly. And this is the beginning. Like I said, this is the tip of the iceberg. This is the most apparent, like with what happened and with the protests and the rally and witnessing that horrific act. That was a catalyst. And what's happening right now, and the change and the reform that's happening, is the melting away of the tip of the iceberg. So as it begins to melt away, we can start to go deeper into all the other issues that have maintained this injustice.
Is it, so for me, the visual that I get just from like a download perspective is, it doesn't feel like the tip of the iceberg is melting. It feels like the water all around it is getting drained, so that it's exposing the rest of that iceberg underneath.
Well, yeah, I like that. I like that visual. I think that's very powerful, and probably a little bit more applicable right now. I think it's like what they say, draining the swamp. The thing that Trump took over. That's true.
I feel curious too, in the sense of the generational trauma that the work that you do, and obviously just the example you gave at the Y felt like generational racism, right? So I'm connecting those two, but also just how pervasive this is, because you said not being told not to go to college, so it's like health, education, policing,
housing,
education.
And I talk about that. I mean, literally, the book, and it wasn't intended to, right? Because it's intended to be like, hey, how do you get over all of this, like, incredible trauma, burnout, childhood that's chaotic? But even looking at today, like, I grew up in the 80s in New York City, and it's like, I'm now in a whole different state, and everything's applicable. Like, I could literally, and it doesn't matter if I met someone who was from, the continent. If I met a Black person in Louisiana, we would have similar life experiences. Mm-hmm. That's one thing that I think when people are always wondering, like, why is it that Black people kind of gravitate towards Black people, no matter where they go? It's like, we all kind of have so many similar life experiences, not exactly the same. But even down to where I was born, like where I was born, my mother married a gentleman who went to Vietnam, came back with PTSD, and he wasn't given the GI Bill of the house in a nice neighborhood. Black veterans had to move into kind of like ghettos or projects. Like here in Richmond, they have, all sorts of courts. Those were the places where Black people were placed. And that's what they got. And then of course you have unemployment when they come back, and they don't have employment, poverty, they're addicted to opium, heroin, all of the other things that come along with it. So even though he went served his country, and this is why I try to always connect the dots, and like policing, like, we're part of the police, we're part of the military. Why hasn't this changed even though we're part of it? Because we didn't change the system. They just let people in. And until we change this, it doesn't matter how much interracial marriage or interracial work or interracial whatever, that doesn't change a system until we become on the same code about what that system is. And why did this man who served his country, why did he have to live in the ghetto? Why wasn't he given a GI Bill for education? Why wasn't he given a job and skill or trade like his white counterpart? And you realize the trauma, domestic violence that my mother endured, and then how that was passed down to her emotional availability to myself and my brothers and sisters. And we're talking generations upon generations. But where did this grow from? Like our families are, have these conditions that, and I compare it to going to see a white family. Our family didn't have the opportunity of humanity and choice and options. Like chapter 4 talks about path taken versus the path chosen for you. And our path is largely chosen. We don't get those many options. And so I think helping people to understand on a personal level how this experience is looked at through the eyes of a child or an 8-year-old. And you're talking to my white family about why I defined everything with them as white, because it was so different. And that's the only thing I noticed that was different. Like they had stuff and we didn't, and white people had stuff and we didn't. And, for 30 years, 35 years later, we could still largely say the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I want to lift up what I'm hearing of, like, this fight is really about having a choice over your life.
Yeah.
How it gets to be, which doors get to open. And I think that's a piece I'm really looking at, is the unchecked, unexamined white privilege, right? There's the kind that can seem overt, but there's I was never told I couldn't go to college or given any of those messages. Even as a person of color, I got enough privilege. So to me, I'm connecting this dot of, like, you're fighting in the streets for your choice to live your truest life.
Exactly.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Beautiful.
I think it's so important to just be able to live free. And I mean, I have friends that are going to move to Ghana and, where they love. And because that's the first thing that they say, it's the first place that they felt free. Everyone looks like them and there's no treating someone differently because everybody's on the same, this is what we do. This is community. And so I think there's a lot of Black people, even people of color, who are just like, I don't even know what that feels like to have to not think about how I'm going to get home, or my son going out and being out till 12. Like I tell people all the time, I don't even sleep until he gets back. It doesn't matter where he goes. I don't even, because I have to make sure he gets all the way back inside the house. So to be able to live free, I think unless we're on vacation somewhere.
Yeah. But that's the promised land, right? Is what you just said, to just be able to have the same offerings, the same justice, the same dignity,
opportunities,
just everything. So that to me is the beloved community that will take, I'm looking at the long game, will take many decades to build.
Yeah. Generations. Yeah. The future generations.
Or maybe it's starting right now.
It is starting now.
Not to invalidate any of the work that anyone's done up until this point. I certainly don't mean that, but this is definitely a sea change moment, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. Sure. I definitely believe that. I think, from what I've heard from people from high school and college, I mean, I think this is something that they're just like, it's almost like they have the beauty of being naive, right? They have that beauty of being naive, so they have so much energy with being naive. And then they don't have all of the history of it, which is kind of okay, because sometimes people work harder when they don't realize all of the work they have to do behind them and in front of them, because they're just working with what's in front of them.
Right. Just being present.
Just like they're like, hey, no, this needs to come down, statutes need to come down, laws need to change.
Let's get it done.
Like this is stupid that we're even, and even them talking to me, it's almost like, that's stupid. I'm like, well, this is just the way it's always been. They don't understand. 20-year-old kids, they don't understand it's always been, because they just got here.
Right.
So they're creating literally as they go. And I
Which is
tell them all
beautiful.
the time, like, that's the most beautiful part
It's so beautiful.
of
Yeah.
being 20. Like, you're actually using your youth to activate people who are my age and older to be like, why is this still stuck? Why
Yeah.
aren't we moving? Why can't it just change tomorrow? Why can't you tear a statue down?
Why
I
not?
literally drove through like Richmond and saw all the statues, and I'm so like old and like in my brain, like, how did they get that high to spray paint? Like, I'm literally figure out how did they who's climbing that? Like, I'm such a mom that I'm like, whose child got up there? I hope it wasn't my child. Like, who that's like, it's 6 stories for that statue. How did you do it? But I'm like, but they don't even think like that. They
just do it. They just
I'm
do
thinking
it.
safety and insurance and how much is that going to be for that broken leg? And no, they're like, who cares about insurance? Who cares? Like, they are on fire here.
Yeah.
And every single race and every single color, like, they're on fire. And there's like even more people. Like, it's almost like what was meant for good, what was meant for evil turned into good. Because actually George Floyd situation activated so many what I would call unconscious white people.
Yeah, activation is a perfect word for that. You know, it was a catalyst. You know, and that's how we can honor his life too, and honor the lives of everyone past him and all the horrific events that have happened for the last 400 years in history. You know.
Yeah, it's activated people in so many different, like, and I see people now like looking at the history, going into history books, you know, doing their research, which is what, you know, should happen, but we're not taught that. So it's what's happening now.
Yeah. Kel, did you want to wrap up with doing
I do, actually.
breathing?
Yes. So I'm going to kind of take it into a little bit of a spiritual realm about what I've been receiving in my own personal meditations and my downloads for the last couple of days. And the message that I keep getting is about breathing, right? About breathing. And if you think about it, about 6 months ago, when the Amazon jungle was starting to burn, remember? And everybody was saying, that's the lungs of the earth, you know? That's how the earth breathes, right? And then COVID hits, and the way most people die is they can't breathe anymore. They're losing the ability to breathe once again, right? And then with this horrific act that we see George Floyd screaming out that he can't breathe, we've gone from a message from the Mother Earth to the collective to an individual. So there's the seeds of that, like, I can't breathe anymore. And if you take that as a spiritual message, like, we need to learn to breathe once again as a human consciousness, as a human race. We need to learn how to breathe together as a collective and understand that we ascend together. We don't ascend separately, you know. There is no gender, no race. When you take away the mask, the personality of the ego and the body, and we understand our multidimensional selves. So I feel like this message about breathing, about the breath as the sacred feminine, receiving, and the exhale as the divine masculine to give. So we receive with the inhale and we give with the exhale. So moving forward, I think that we need to, as the earth is beginning to re-breathe again, and we begin to come out of the cocoons of our self-isolation, and we begin to breathe together, we need to understand with the breath can connect us to our divine self. So we can begin to shine and be not afraid to be seen, all of us. So.
That's great. Well, Khadija, thank you so much for joining us today. Just honoring you so much, and appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much.
So much. It was amazing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. It was so powerful.
Thank you. Thank you for continuing to do this work and have these conversations. So anything you need, please let me know.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.